All right, guys, so here we are in our first PowerPoint for quarter 2. We are on section 4.1, which is all about chemical energy and this thing called ATP. So make sure you title your notebook pages Chemical Energy and ATP. Again, this is section 4.1. Our key concept is that all cells need some kind of energy, and that's chemical energy. Our key vocabulary, we only have 2 words, ATP and ADP. Our main ideas are the chemical energy used for most cell processes is carried by this chemical called ATP. And organisms break down carbon-based molecules to produce ATP. Objectives, we need to recognize the importance of ATP as an energy-carrying molecule. Essential questions, only one of them, why is ATP useful for cells? And if you think about it, I just told you ATP is chemical energy, so think about that when we think about this essential question. So what chemicals power the cell? Well, cells use a special chemical to store and release energy. And again, remember, we need energy to fuel our cells. Everything we do is based on energy. The chemical we use is called ATP. It stands for adenosine triphosphate. Tri for 3. So ATP releases and stores energy by breaking and reforming the bonds between its phosphate groups. And when the bonds are broken, energy is released, and then they get formed back together, and we'll talk about that again on the next slide. So we have 2 things. We have ATP and we have ADP. ATP, again, is adenosine triphosphate. It's the high energy molecule that contains within its bonds energies that cells can use. Once we use up the energies, those bonds get broken and they turn into this thing called ADP. ADP, adenosine diphosphate, di for 2, is a low energy molecule that can be converted to ATP, and it only has 2 phosphates. 3 is for ATP. ATP, 3 phosphates. ADP, 2 phosphates. So ATP transfers energy from the breakdown of food molecules to cell functions, and energy is released anytime a phosphate group is removed. So when those bonds in ATP, remember T for tri, we started with 3 phosphates. When we use up the energy, it goes down to diphosphate, ADP. We've used up one of the phosphates. Then ADP gets changed back into ATP when we bring back a phosphate group, or we add a phosphate group to it again. Okay, so we have this whole cycle. So we have ATP, which is our energy producing molecule, adenosine triphosphate. When we use up the energy, it gets broken down into ADP, D for 2 phosphates. Then when we eat food or something else, we recharge that molecule, turning it back into ATP. So here's just a closer view. I would like you to draw this in your notebooks, please. So remember, ATP, energy, molecule. All of our cells use ATP for energy. Once we use up that energy, we get that out of breaking the phosphate bonds, turns into ADP, adenosine diphosphate for 2 phosphates. We eat food and we recharge that molecule by adding a phosphate back, so it turns back into ATP, and the whole process starts over. So we can think about the ATP and the ADP cycle like a rechargeable battery. Like I said, we start off with ATP. When we use up or break those bonds in the phosphates, we use up that energy. To recharge that molecule, we eat some food. It recharges that ADP molecule back into ATP. So the chemical energy used for most cell processes is carried by ATP, and molecules in food store that chemical energy in their bonds. So when we eat things like a carbohydrate, that gives us a lot of energy. Okay, if we eat things like this just goes into more details, but really you just need to know about carbohydrates are the molecules most commonly broke down to make ATP. Remember, carbohydrates give us energy, and they give us energy in the form of ATP. That's a chemical form of energy. The next form of energy where we can get ATP is fats. Now, you don't break down fats as often as carbohydrates because you eat a lot of carbohydrates, but fats store a lot of energy as well. And then lastly, we can get energy from proteins if proteins end up in your body getting broken down. And again, those aren't very likely, but our main source of energy is those carbohydrates. Okay, So some questions, and I've got some questions and some answers for you just about ADP and ATP. So basically we've got ATP and ADP, and we want to know how are they alike? Well, they both contain this thing called adenosine, which is a chemical, and they both contain phosphate groups. But how are they different? Well, ATP, the T stands for 3, so it's got 3 phosphate groups, and ADP, D stands for di, and it has 2 phosphate groups. And why is the difference important? Well, the energy in those bonds, or stored in those bonds, is a potential source of energy. So ATP has 3 bonds holding the phosphate groups together. When those bonds get broken, it releases energy. And then when the bonds form, they store energy. And if we describe the relationship between energy stored in food and ATP, well, the food molecules store chemical energy in their bonds, and food is broken down into smaller molecules that are then broken down further to transfer this energy to ATP, which is the chemical form of energy. And how do lipids and carbohydrates differ in ATP production? Well, lipids provide more ATP than carbohydrates do, but we burn carbohydrates first, so they're the first or the main source of energy for our cells. And then getting back to our essential question, why is ATP useful for cells? Well, think about it. What do we need to do? What do we do in a day? Everything we do requires energy. So ATP is useful for cells because it's the chemical form of energy that our cells use. All right, guys, that is it for section 4.1, and I will see you in the next video.